All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today at this Doors Open event. We're a little bit, two-thirds of the way through the month. And so my name is Margaret DeArchangelis. I am the chair of the Doors Open Baltimore Planning Committee, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our session today. I want to thank everyone who's donated to be with us, and to especially thank our Doors Open sponsors, our grantors, and our in-kind supporters. Through your support, we've been able to host free Doors Open programs nearly every day this month, and that will continue through the rest of the month. Today's program is part of Doors Open Baltimore's Arts and Culture Week. I hope you can join us this evening as well for a presentation on the renovation of 1 West Mount Vernon Place. You can get links to that presentation as well as all of our additional Doors Open offerings on our website, which is www.doorsopenbaltimore.org. I also encourage everyone to participate in our Instagram at-home photo contest. We'd love to see photos of buildings around your neighborhood that you like. Use the hashtag DoorsOpenBaltimore to use that hashtag to participate. And the contest ends on October 31st, and prizes will be available. Now, moving on to today's presentation, we are joined by Michelle Fitzgerald, the Assistant Curator at Johns Hopkins University Museums. Michelle's going to go through and do her presentation, which is going to focus largely, I think, on the exterior of the building, so that folks might have the opportunity to go exploring on their own, even in the midst of the pandemic. And I encourage everyone to please add your questions to the chat box in the Zoom feature. I will, at the end of the presentation, I'll read through those questions, and we'll get as many answered as time allows. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle.
All right, I will share my screen. All right. Well, thank you all for joining me today on this Doors Open Baltimore talk. As Margaret said, my name is Michelle Fitzgerald. I am the Assistant Curator at Johns Hopkins University Museums. That's Evergreen Museum and Homewood Museum. So I think you all got to hear about Evergreen last week. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of Homewood today. And normally, we open the house on Doors Open for tours, and are also generally open to the public throughout the year, but we are currently closed due to COVID-19. But that doesn't mean we can't take some time to have a virtual tour of the Homewood estate and grounds today. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Homewood Museum, it's a Federal era house built between 1801 and 1802 for the Carroll family of Maryland. Initially, it was a summer country estate, but the city, of course, grew around it. And now it sits on the Johns Hopkins University campus right off Charles Street. The house received National Historic Landmark status in 1971 due to its significance as one of the best examples of American Federal Palladian architecture. And of course, we have some details of the house here. This is in the back portico, and it's showing some of the carving and columns here to give you a sense of the intricacy of the detail that you can see when you walk around this house. And so, why Homewood received its reputation as a great example of Palladian architecture, and why that is important for us to keep in mind when we think about this building, is really going to be the thread of our conversation today. But to be mindful of your time and lunch breaks, I'm aiming to keep this talk kind of short. So I hope you will take it as an introduction to our wonderful museum. And I think we should have some time for questions after as well. So today we're not going to go over just the building itself, but also explore a little bit more of the exterior through its former and current landscape to really understand all the components that make Homewood one of the best preserved examples of this window into Baltimore's early 19th century history. So even while we're closed, you can go take a look yourself at the exterior of the house. So we'll do some of the nature and exterior today, and you can come see some discussion of nature and the interior in person later. And that landscape is going to be a particular focus that I'm going to ask you to keep in mind as I talk about the house as well, because one of the things Homewood's design highlights is how architecture fits into nature. So for anyone interested in this, I highly recommend you rejoin us at Homewood when we reopen to see our exhibition, Naturally Beautiful, which explores the natural world through the interiors of Homewood Museum. But first, let's talk a little bit about the intent behind Homewood and how the building came to exist. The house was owned by Charles Carroll of Homewood, the son of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who is of course the only Catholic and longest living signer of the Declaration of Independence. So the Carroll family had been in Maryland since the late 17th century, early 18th century, and quickly through land acquisition became one of the wealthiest families in Maryland. Carroll of Carrollton's only son, Carroll of Homewood, nice and they're all named Charles in this family tree. He marries Harriet Chew from another prominent American family from Germantown, Pennsylvania. The Chew family is, of course, associated with the Cliveden estate in Germantown, if any of you are interested in exploring that. And Harriet was a very popular member of the Republican court. So she was really in the social circles around the Washingtons during the first presidency. So Charles and Harriet were married and they were given $10,000 to build their home. Charles Carroll of Carrollton really wanted them to make additions to an already constructed house with that money, but Charles Carroll of Homewood opted to build from scratch. And Carroll of Homewood buys a plot of land outside the city for their summer country estate, which he names Homewood. The house was sort of intended to be a bit of a training ground for Charles Carroll of Homewood to practice running a farm for him to one day take over the family plantation, Doregan, in what is now Howard County. In total, Charles Carroll of Homewood spends about $40,000 of his father's money. Remember, he was originally given $10,000 in the construction of Homewood. So the labor to build this house required both skilled and unskilled by freed and enslaved men. And a lot of the design of the building is attributed to the Edwards brothers, who were master carpenters in Baltimore that worked on several other estates. Some of you may be familiar with Montebello, potentially Brooklyn Wood, and the Craig House, whose interior is actually the Baltimore dining room at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, if any of you are familiar with those buildings. So if you think about the carvings of the portico we saw earlier, a lot of the fine exterior and interior carving is really attributed to the Edwards partnership with Charles Carroll of Homewood. But to really understand the architectural style of Homewood, we have to jump back in time a little bit, 3 centuries earlier and across the Atlantic to Italy. So Palladianism is a 16th century Italian style developed by the architect Andrea Palladio, who based a lot of his designs on the architecture of ancient Rome. He mainly designed modest-sized country villas, which he made impressive through the use of temple facades. He, of course, published a couple books on his designs that contain a wealth of advice on building design as well as technology. So it includes how to construct a masonry wall, how to choose the best lime for mortar, and he describes the ideal proportions for the 5 classical orders as well as doors and windows and entire rooms. So it's really detailed. The final section also illustrates buildings from ancient Rome as reconstructed by Palladio from archaeological fragments, which in typical sort of humanist fashion were meant as models for new building and the source of good principles. This concept of principles and morality was a critically important part of the theory behind Palladianism. It's the sort of idea that by virtue of using symmetry, you are mirroring a rightness in nature. So this idea of a natural order to things. And this feeds into some of the features of Palladianism, including sometimes the use of classical orders, which you can see especially in columns is how we typically associate it. Temple fronts, proportion, and symmetry really being of the utmost importance in this architecture. And so if we fast forward over a century and a half to England, and in the early 1700s, several English translations of Palladio's work appear, sparking sort of this renewed interest in Palladianism among country houses in England. And really the most faithful of these translated architectural books was Isaac Ware's 1738 copy, which was by far one of the most popular and highly distributed. Other English translations were not always as faithful to Palladio's original concepts of architecture. And I'm pretty sure actually that Jefferson, in fact, had one of those sort of zanier translations in his collection, which is potentially why Monticello is ultimately a little bit of a bizarre interpretation of the Palladian style when you're looking at it for a while. And these translations also had a significance in that they influenced pattern books of the period, which include descriptions and images for interiors, furniture, and other design details. One of these resulting pattern books was William Payne's The Practical House Carpenter, published in 1794, which really influences the interiors of Homewood. And we do know that the Baltimore Library Company had both William Payne's book as well as Francis Price's British Carpenter, another pattern book, which we suspect were used by the designers of Homewood. So as the distribution of William Payne's book in the United States just sort of indicated, the influence of 18th century Palladianism was not really limited to the English country houses. If you take a moment, you can look at this Robert Adam design north front of Kettleston Hall in England with the similar sort of layout you may have noticed at Homewood earlier with that main central building and then some wings. And that's really a pattern that you see again in American homes, such as Annapolis's Hammond Harwood house, pictured here at the top left. And American Palladianism particularly picks up steam among prominent houses in the late 18th or very early 19th century and appears in extremely famous and well-visited estates like Monticello that we mentioned earlier, and in the New Room addition to George Washington's Mount Vernon, pictured on the bottom right here. So going back to what we discussed earlier in terms of Palladio's concept of a tie between architecture and morality, this was really particularly appealing to the United States. Even more so, the influence of ancient Roman buildings on his design assisted in connecting the new country looking to attempt a new form of government with the empires of the past. And we touched a little bit on what the Palladian building might look like in the 16th century in Italy, but what makes an early 19th century building such a strong example of a neoclassical Palladian style? And that answer can really be broken down into 4 specific traits. First is the Palladian window, which you can kind of make out highlighted here in the red boxes, and in the Washington's New Room, as you saw on the last slide. And that's where you have an arched window flanked by columns, which Palladio particularly liked to use in his buildings. There's also, of course, the temple front portico added to the front of the buildings, and probably the most obvious, at least to our modern eyes, sort of hearkening to ancient Roman structures. You can also, just looking at the overall of this building, take in the general symmetry of the structure. Homewood, in fact, has one fake window in its dining room for the sake of symmetry on both the outside and practicality on the inside. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, you can also look for the 5-part plan structure that we saw earlier in both Hammond Harwood House and somewhat in the English manner of Kettleston Hall. This is really a critical component of Chesapeake architecture because in part, when you have the front and back doors open to this house, it allows for maximal air circulation and cooling throughout the house. Remember, this is a summer country house in the Chesapeake. And this 5-part plan consists of one center building, number 3 here, with 2 wings, 1 and 5, that are connected by hyphens, which is 2 and 4 here. But for fully understanding the American Palladian style in these country houses and plantations, it's important to really examine the context of the building within its landscape. For Palladio, the symmetry and the proportion of his buildings demonstrated and highlighted an order in nature. And this sort of connects to, in the 18th century, the Swedish philosopher Carl Linnaeus, who echoed this concept with a literal design of a natural order, suggesting that there's a sort of hierarchy in science to ordering the natural world. And for Palladio, the order of the man-made building complemented a constructed but natural landscape surrounding the buildings, something that's particularly of interest to early Americans. And you can really see this concept of nature as an organized hierarchy in Charles Willson Peale's famous painting, The Artist and His Museum, in which Peale, as a self-portrait here, is pulling back the curtain on his museum on the second floor of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And when you look behind Peale, you can see arranged on the wall taxidermied American animals all along the walls there. And then you can barely make up along the top of the wall Peale's portraits of American Revolutionary War heroes, creating a literal hierarchy with man's placement in the natural order at the top above these animals. And of course, a little less relevant to our talk today, but I'd be really remiss to ever show this painting and not point out the skeleton behind Peale and to his left, which is, of course, the enormous mastodon that Peale exhumed in upstate New York. And it was displayed in Peale's Baltimore Museum, as well as the Philadelphia site. For early 19th century Baltimore country estates, these gardens that they have around them were spaces of entertainment for guests and another component of the house that the main building was intended to smoothly fit into. So like Peale's portraits at the top of the wall, the house within the natural but landscaped garden created a sense of order in the space that would have really made Palladio proud, I think. And once again, this is a stylistic development that, while in some parts American influenced, also speaks in conversations a lot with developments in England, particularly the landscapes of Lancelot Capability Brown, who designed country house gardens that were ordered, but more natural looking than the organized landscapes of Tudor gardens. So you might think of Hampton Court, for instance, if you're trying to think of a Tudor garden. And Brown really, you can see in this picture, limits his use of color to a single hue, green, and likewise limited the variety of plant material used. So he's trying to lead the eye through the landscape, and Brown placed single trees in the foreground, larger clumps in the middle ground, and full-scale woodlands in the distance. And he also tends to incorporate a lot of follies and bridges, so sort of man-made architectural elements throughout this seemingly natural landscape, many of which can really evoke Palladian sort of temple-like styles. And descriptions of Homewood's original landscape really suggest that Homewood very much so follows in Brown's footsteps with this. So visitors to Homewood would have processed up this mile-long winding road that offered glimpses of the main building through trees to create this sort of romantic approach to the Palladian house. And this is a lot of text, but I wanted to just put this up here for you all to skim. This is an advertisement for the house in 1819 when it was placed for rent, which describes the outbuildings and landscape. And you can see it highlights the clumps of forest trees. So talking about Brown's placement a little bit too in those gardens. And those would have been ornamental for the enjoyment of visitors. We also know that Charles Carroll of Homewood put a lot of his financial energy into the design of, excuse me, the Homewood landscape as well, highlighting how important this was to impress a visitor as much so as the expenses of the house itself. And a really good example of this is one of the landscape structures that really highlights this, and that's the stone bridge that Charles Carroll of Homewood commissioned for $100. When Charles Carroll of Carrollton, his father, heard of the cost of this bridge, he claimed that the builder had led Charles Carroll of Homewood into extravagant expenditures to swell his commission and his count. And that's something that sort of continues on as a discussion even a year later when the father once again hears of his son's changes to Homewood's dairy outbuilding, including adding windows when there had been none, so not minor changes, and the additional cost of that. So it's very stressful for the father, this whole building process. And these outbuildings were also utterly crucial to this overall architecture and landscape of Homewood's 120 acres. We do have two surviving buildings today that you could see on a walk around campus. The privy pictured on the lower left and the carriage house or the barn on the top right here. And so how you would have come across these as an early 19th century visitor is 2/3 of the way up the hill. Upon entering, visitors encountered the largest outbuilding, so that's the barn, which had Palladian windows and a cupola. It was also functional. It was built on a hill, so the south side would provide sort of a warm, cozy place for animals, while the north side would have stored hay and had good ventilation. Just past that barn, the vista really opens up to the expanse of lawn in front of the house, with the house itself spanning the crest of the hill. So that's really the first time you'd come across it on the drive in full. And exactly as suggested sort of by landscape design books of the day, Homewood is really situated to the most dramatic advantage at any viewpoint. And behind the house are several more outbuildings, like the privy, which has a dome ceiling, wooden paneling, and separate sides for men and women. So the privy really highlights how fancy these working buildings were with sort of unnecessary design additions at times. And as a side note, if you do see the privy on any walks on campus, I really suggest peeking in some of the windows where you'll be able to make out some graffiti that is over 100 years old, because the privy was still in use when Homewood served as the Gilman Country School in the early 20th century. So there's some really hilarious and somewhat inappropriate schoolboy graffiti remaining in the space that you can enjoy if you can see it. The privy does sit on a circle, the radius of which was the length of the house, within which we believe were the formal gardens. There was probably another outbuilding at 10 o'clock from the house to match the privy, which sort of situated at 2 o'clock, creating a really organized layout even beyond the house. And the overall result of the building and landscape was intended to relate the building to the landscape in a rational and mathematical way. The overall result was a success stylistically, and it remained one of the most well-known country houses in the city, even being depicted in a suite of chairs showing Baltimore views at the Baltimore Museum of Art now, the detail of which is pictured here. So now that we know it was a stylistic success, why else would Charles Carroll of Homewood pick the neoclassical Palladian style for his home? We know that its popularity in America was likely a highly contributing factor for the society and fashion-driven Carroll, but there's a more interesting sort of psychology of conflicting principles that appear in the selection of style as well, particularly for Chesapeake owners, I would say. For early American private, but especially public buildings, as we touched on, there was an important assertion of the country's democratic government and connection to Rome and everything they did, from the layout of a Senate chamber to selection of furnishings and overall building construction. So the Virginia State Capitol is a really good example of this, which began construction in 1785 and was designed to create a literal temple of democracy. For Jefferson, who was of course involved in the construction of this building, he was sort of introduced to the design of Roman temples through Palladio's 4 books and was directly inspired by a Roman temple in southern France for this building. And even at Homewood, we can see this sort of Roman influence directly in the temple facade, and have to note how interesting it is that these private residents sought to connect their homes to temples, a direct connotation to concepts of religion and morality. And of course, while the Carrolls certainly viewed themselves as Americans and independent of the British Empire that they had so recently fought for their freedom of, they were ironically still strongly influenced by English style, as evidenced in the selection of the Palladian style and their consistent purchase of English furniture and goods, both before and even after the Revolution. So you have to kind of enjoy the irony that a style that Americans view as an assertion of democracy is also a bit of an assertion of the English style as well. But I would say one of the biggest sort of conflicts in the architectural style of Homewood and its connected moral assertions is, of course, that the building was built by, lived in, and worked in by enslaved people who would not have experienced the freedom connected with the American democracy the style asserts. Very likely, nor would they have viewed their enslavers who refused to see their humanity as moral beings who were deserving of their place on the social hierarchy. And to this day, we really only have very informed, educated, but still guesses as to the enslaved sleeping and living spaces on the Homewood property. So we don't confidently have that information in the same way we can clearly identify the master bedchamber or the drawing room, because the house is designed to obscure those realities of the Chesapeake house. And the result of all these thoughts is a building that is a significant example capturing a particular and conflicting moment in American history. From the selection of plants in the landscape to the design of the outbuildings to the temple facade portico, Homewood is really a piece of art that can tell us so much about the complex social and political history of this moment in time, not just its style. And I don't want you to think that the house's history and influence stops in the early 19th century either, because the study of Homewood's architectural style is also directly important to the studying of architecture of more recently constructed buildings, namely those constructed on the Hopkins campus, which are directly influenced by Homewood. And the campus both it's kind of interesting design relationship, because it works to both preserve Homewood for its architectural beauty, while also in some ways, via necessity of constructing a campus, it also obscures the realities of Homewood as a working farm and that sort of original landscape you would have seen with that. But we can still see some views of Homewood's landscape that you would encounter on a walk through campus, even in places that we may not expect it. It just takes sort of a close look and a stroll around the area on your next walk. The Baltimore Museum of Art's Sculpture Garden, which is comparably very low terrain compared to the rest of the Baltimore Museum of Art and JHU campus, is believed to be the most original terrain of the Homewood estate, where visitors would progress on a 1-mile drive up to Homewood, getting those glimpses we were talking about on the way up. So in some ways, understanding the design of Homewood also helps us to understand the present and the present and the past layout of this city. And with that, I'm going to conclude for today, and thank you for your time. And I'm going to have my email up here just for a moment in case anyone has further questions after the Q&A. And we do hope to see you in the future when we reopen. And just to conclude, for the time being, we are still virtually open and have virtual programming. So if you would like to learn more about the early 19th century Baltimore, I do hope you will join us for our annual Antiques Forum this November, focusing on paintings and prints of the city in the Federal era. And if we have time, I'm going to stop screen sharing, but I'm also happy to take any questions as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. So I've got a couple of questions have come in over the course of the presentation, and I encourage people to, if you do have any questions, to please pop them into the chat, and I will relay them back to our speaker. So the first question that we got is, how did JHU end up being on this Carroll property?
That's that's kind of a long and interesting story, but I'm going to try and go through it very quickly. So you'll have to forgive me because I'm going to miss some of the important details here. But the Carroll family the house is not a happy home when the Carroll family lives there. Charles Carroll of Homewood had a lot of drinking and gambling issues, and Harriet does leave the marriage in 1816 and go back to Philadelphia. And so after that, Homewood's sort of a home where Carroll, I always picture it very like Jane Eyre style, like he's kind of in there as this violent person for a while, splitting his time between Doe-Regan and there. So when his son, Charles Carroll of Doe-Regan, because they're all Charles, inherits the property, he's there for a while, but they do ultimately sell Homewood. And that goes, I believe it goes to another family. North Charles Street is constructed. They think it's too noisy, so they sell it again. It ends up being a Wyman property. And so Samuel Wymandel, Baltimore Museum of Art, and then from there, the property is sold by Wyman to the Hopkins campus, or to Johns Hopkins University for the purpose of building a campus.
Okay, great, thank you. And then the next question, is this the same Carroll family that owned the land in Ellicott City that's now the shrine at St. Anthony's?
It's the same one. It's a big family. They own considerable land, particularly in, I would say, Howard County is where a lot of their land is now. But they are also the ones of the Charles Carroll House in Annapolis, and the Charles Carroll Mansion in downtown Baltimore, and the one in Ellicott City, and Doregan, which is not open to the public.
And you may have covered this when you talked about the change in the family in the beginning of the 1800s, but why was there a need to rent the home in 1819, as we saw in that clipping that you showed us?
Sure, that's a great question. It's not really being actively used by that point. So Charles Carroll of Homewood at that point is mostly with his father. I'm trying to remember his death date. I did post it, but I'm blanking out right now. I believe he's still alive at that time, is mostly with his father. If not, he does not outlive his father. So it's not really being occupied around then.
Got it. Okay. And could you repeat for the group what you mentioned about the Baltimore room at the Met?
Oh, sure. So the Baltimore dining room at the Met, for any of you that have gone through that American wing, there's a lot of furnished rooms there, sort of like you used to see at the Baltimore Museum of Art as well. And their Baltimore dining room, that interior is from the Craig House, which is attributed to the Edwards brothers in design. And they were also the ones that are attributed to Homewood.
Okay, great. Well, are there other questions? Oh, there are some more. All right, Michelle, could you put your email address? Can you do the screen sharing?
Yes.
Or actually, if you could type it, maybe just type it into the chat. That might be the easiest way to
I will type it into the chat.
Okay. And then I'm seeing another note here that someone heard that the cost overruns at Homewood were largely due to the elaborate woodwork and the trim inside of the house. Do you have any background information on that?
It certainly didn't help the cost overruns. For any of you that get the opportunity to visit Homewood afterwards, you will see that we have extremely elaborate woodwork. That's very Robert Adam sort of, for any like English country house fans there. It doesn't help, but he really goes ham on any part he can in terms of spending and style. So it's all sort of contributing.
Okay. And when you are able to reopen to the public, the tours, what do they normally have? Are there a couple of different tours or just one tour that everybody would take?
That's a great question. Right now, we do have a general tour that everyone can take. That's a guided tour through the house. I'm seeing some of our docents actually on this talk. So we have some really wonderful docents at Homewood that will take you through. That's about an hour. As Naturally Beautiful is up, there is the opportunity. That's through the whole house. So there is sort of a supplemental tour that you can take that's also guided for that exhibit in particular.
Okay, wonderful. Are there other questions out there from folks in attendance? While I wait for those questions to come in, I do just want to redirect everybody back to the chat. Folks have added in a couple of interesting tidbits, facts that they know about the Carroll family. But I also want to remind people that if you've missed any of our presentations over the course of October, that you can access recordings of almost everything that we've done as part of Doors Open. And by visiting you can go to YouTube and search for AIA Baltimore. That will take you to the AIA Baltimore Architecture Foundation channel, and you can find recordings of many of these programs. Also check out our Doors Open Baltimore website, where you can register for the handful of programs that we have going on through the rest of this month. Next week, we are going to be featuring award-winning sites, specifically things tied to AIA's Design Awards Week. So, okay, let's see. I've got a few more. Are there images of the interior available online if folks want to see that right now?
Sure. You'll be able to see some on the internet, online through the Homewood website. I would also recommend Homewood does have a publication that you can either purchase or find in the library that I believe is called Homewood House. It's Homewood House. And that has some really great images of the interior as well.
Great. And how much of the building is considered original?
A considerable amount of the building is original. We only have 2 outbuildings left, as I pointed out, but I would argue that the building itself is the best part of our collection in terms of how much is preserved. You are not looking at the original roof of Homewood. In the case of many historic houses as well, I would argue we had a little bit of restoration work done on the roof, but a lot of the interior woodwork and construction of it is original.
Okay. And then a clarifying question, was the privy the outdoor toilet for the house itself, or was that for the outbuildings?
The privy is the outbuilding toilet. It's the exterior toilet for Homewood. The Carrolls would have also had a chamber pot or in the space as well, but the privy would have been the outbuilding for it.
Okay. And then do you happen to know, did Charles Carroll of Homewood operate the farm at, I'm seeing you shake your head, so maybe you know how to pronounce that.
Yes, at Reagan. Yes, he did not ultimately operate the farm. As I said, he had a lot of alcoholism and gambling issues, a very violent temper, and he becomes very sick and does not, he predeceases his father. So the property goes from Charles Carroll of Carrollton to his grandson, Charles Carroll of Reagan.
Okay, and this is an architectural term that I am not familiar with. Does the house interior layout have an enfilade?
I'm going to take a stab at that, I think, and I hope someone jumps in the comments if I have this wrong. Excuse me, there's an ambulance going by. But that's a hallway with doors lined up to it, right, of rooms symmetrically. I have a furniture background, so okay,
yes,
good. Yes. Right. We do have that. Thank you for the clarification. Yes, that is sort of when you're going. I would encourage you to imagine that central building has a long cross hall. And as you're going through that cross hall, there are rooms laid out, particularly if you are walking sort of from the far right of Homewood to the far left, you will see those buildings come on your left, a lot of the rooms. And then there's a couple to the right.
Okay, someone who has built his current home as a replica of Homewood. So the Palladian style lives on.
It continues on today. Homewood's influence.
Wonderful. Well, are there other questions from the audience? I do see a note. I got a private note asking if the Evergreen tour is on the YouTube channel, and I'm not sure, but Nathan, if you know and could share that link if it is available, that would be great.
Yeah, it is available.
Okay. Wonderful. All right. Well, then with that, I am going to conclude today's session, but it was wonderful to have you join us, Michelle, and thank you very much for the presentation. And I encourage everybody to wander the grounds at Homewood and see the house and enjoy these last days of fall.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.